In 1871, a 34-year-old banker in New York controlled less than 1% of America's financial system. By 1895, he had personally rescued the United States Treasury twice. By 1907, one man's decision to intervene in a financial panic determined whether the entire American economy would survive the week. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. He never held public office. He was never elected. He was never appointed. He was a private citizen, and he had more power over your money than any president in American history. Because when you follow the chain of capital, when you trace who actually controlled American steel, American railroads, American electricity, and American banking, you discover something disturbing. One man, across 4 decades, designed it that way, deliberately. He built a system where American industry could not function without his approval, where governments came to him, not the other way around, where the architecture of modern capitalism was in every meaningful sense his personal blueprint. This isn't just history, this is 2025. The bank you borrow from, J.P. Morgan Chase, bears his name. The electric grid that powers your home, he funded it. The U.S. Steel Company that built modern infrastructure, he created it. The Federal Reserve System that controls your interest rates, modeled on the emergency framework he invented. Every single one uses the Morgan playbook. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The congressional hearings happened. The Pujo Committee testimony is public record. The balance sheets exist. The mergers are filed. The meetings happened, the contracts exist, the mechanisms are public record. Let me show you exactly how J.P. Morgan built this system, how he used it to become the most powerful unelected man in American history, how the government's attempt to break his power actually made his system permanent, and why 112 years after his death, you still live in the world Morgan designed. Because understanding the system isn't academic, it's survival. Before 1871, American banking worked the old way. Hundreds of independent banks, state-chartered, privately owned, loosely regulated, each issued their own currency. A dollar from a Cincinnati bank wasn't worth a dollar in New York. Interest rates were set locally. Capital didn't flow between industries, and when an industry needed massive investment, railroads, steel, electricity, there was no mechanism to assemble it. It was chaotic. Companies rose and collapsed not because of their products, but because their financing dried up. Railroads went bankrupt mid-construction. Investors lost fortunes to panics they never saw coming. The economy lurched between boom and crisis every decade. But it was contained. No single bank was large enough to cause a national collapse. No single banker had enough power to stop one. That was about to change. J.P. Morgan changed everything. He was born in 1837 in Hartford, Connecticut. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was already a powerful transatlantic banker, a partner in London's most prestigious financial house. This combination would define Morgan's entire approach to money: European discipline, American ambition, and the unshakable belief that markets required order. His order. In 1869, Morgan had his first taste of what he would become. 2 railroad titans, Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, were locked in a brutal war for control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. Stock manipulation, armed confrontations, legal chaos. The railroad was paralyzed, investors terrified. Morgan stepped in, not as a combatant, as a mediator, as an arbiter. He reorganized the railroad, brokered the settlement, restored order, and took a seat on the board. But here's the innovation. Morgan didn't just solve the problem, he realized that the problem itself, financial chaos, was the opportunity.
If he could position himself as the man who brought order, he wouldn't need to own companies. He would control them through the boards, through the debt, through the reorganization process itself. He called it Morganization. The method was simple and devastating. Find an industry in chaos, step in as the organizer, restructure the debt, meaning the company now owes money to Morgan's bank, place Morgan's representatives on the board, eliminate competition through consolidation, and then collect fees, interest, and influence forever. It wasn't investment banking, it was the industrialization of control.
Here's how it worked. First, Morgan's bank would provide emergency capital to a distressed company, railroads, steel mills, utilities, at the moment of maximum desperation. Second, in exchange for the capital, the company restructured its debt through Morgan. This meant Morgan's bank now sat between the company and its creditors. Every interest payment, every refinancing, every new bond issue ran through him. Third, Morgan placed his own men on the board of directors, not temporarily, permanently. They were called Morgan men. Their job was to ensure stability, which meant ensuring no major decision happened without Morgan's knowledge and approval. But here's the critical detail. Morgan didn't do this once. He did it simultaneously across entire industries. By 1900, Morgan or his partners sat on the boards of New York Central Railroad, Erie Railroad, Northern Pacific Railroad, General Electric, AT&T, First National Bank of New York, and dozens more. And here's what nobody explains about why this was brilliant for Morgan. He didn't need to own them. Ownership creates liability. Ownership requires capital. Control requires neither. When you sit on every board, when every company's debt runs through your bank, when every major transaction requires your signature, you don't own the economy, you are the economy. Within 20 years, every major American industry copied or was absorbed by the model. In 1891, Morgan merged Edison General Electric with Thomson Houston Electric Company. The result? General Electric. One company. His company. In 1901, Morgan pulled off what was at the time the largest corporate transaction in human history. He bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie for $480 million, roughly $17 billion in today's money, and merged it with dozens of other steel companies to create U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Carnegie reportedly said after signing the papers, "I should have asked for $100 million more." Morgan replied, "You would have gotten it." But here's where it gets darker. By 1912, a congressional investigation, the Pujo Committee, revealed the full scope of what Morgan had built. The money trust, they called it. Morgan and his close associates held 341 directorships in 112 corporations, with combined resources of over $22 billion in an economy whose entire GDP was roughly $39 billion. More than half the productive capital of the United States ran through Morgan's network. This wasn't just efficient, this was the privatization of the American economy. But the public was turning against Morgan. President Theodore Roosevelt had already launched antitrust action against Northern Securities, a Morgan Railroad holding company, in 1902. The Supreme Court ordered it dissolved. Morgan reportedly went to Roosevelt personally and said, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt refused. The era of trust busting had begun. And then came 1907. The panic of 1907 was catastrophic. Banks were failing across the country. Stock prices collapsed 50% in 3 weeks. New York City was days away from defaulting on its municipal debt. The U.S. Treasury was helpless. There was no central bank, no mechanism to inject liquidity into the system. The government called Morgan.
At 71 years old, Morgan locked the most powerful bankers in America in his private library on Madison Avenue and refused to let them until they had agreed to a rescue package. He personally organized $25 million in emergency capital over the course of a single weekend. He saved the American economy, alone, as a private citizen, with no legal authority whatsoever. The outcry was enormous, not just gratitude, but terror. What does it mean that one man can do what the government cannot?
This should have been the end, the moment the government seized back control. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of the system's evolution. Because the government's response to Morgan's unchecked power, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, was not a rejection of the Morgan model. It was the institutionalization of it. The Federal Reserve was designed in secret. In November 1910, a group of bankers and a senator boarded a private train from Hoboken, New Jersey, pretending to be duck hunters. They traveled to Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private resort owned by Morgan and his associates. Over 9 days, they drafted what would become the Federal Reserve Act. The men in that room represented roughly 1/6 of the world's entire wealth. Morgan didn't attend personally. He died in March 1913, 8 months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed. But his system attended in his place. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, was modeled on the emergency framework Morgan had improvised in 1907, a lender of last resort, a mechanism to inject capital into a failing system, a backstop for the banks. Morgan's personal rescue operation became national infrastructure. When Morgan died, his estate was worth approximately $80 million. Adjusted for today, that's roughly $2.5 billion. John D. Rockefeller, upon hearing this, reportedly said, "And to think he wasn't even a rich man." He was right. Morgan's real wealth was never in money. It was in architecture. 112 years later, we live in that system. J.P. Morgan Chase, the direct descendant of J.P. Morgan's bank, is the largest bank in the United States with over $3.9 trillion in assets. General Electric, which Morgan created, shaped the infrastructure of the 20th century. U.S. Steel, which Morgan built, defined American industrial power for 50 years. The Federal Reserve, which Morgan's framework inspired, has injected trillions of dollars into the financial system in every crisis since 1913, including 2008 and again in 2020. The Morganization of America, consolidation, board control, debt architecture, is now called institutional investing. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they don't own companies in the old sense. They sit on the boards. They control the debt. They are the creditors. Morgan didn't just create a bank. He created the template that every financial power structure since has copied. The consolidation he started has reached its logical conclusion. 5 banks control 50% of all U.S. banking assets. 3 asset managers effectively vote on the governance of most of the S&P 500. And the Federal Reserve, created in direct response to Morgan's unchecked power, is now the most powerful financial institution in human history. Morgan would recognize every single piece of it.
One architect, 4 decades, one system. Here's the final truth. The 2008 financial crisis, the $700 billion bailout, the Fed's emergency lending, the too big to fail doctrine, wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. Because Morgan's core insight was this: if you make yourself essential to enough people, the government cannot let you fail. He proved it in 1907. The banks proved it in 2008, and every institution that followed understood the lesson. The trap is complete, and escape is impossible, not without dismantling the financial architecture of the entire Western economy. If this video showed you a system you'd never quite seen before, if you finally understand that American capitalism wasn't built by markets, it was built by one man in one library
on one weekend in 1907, then you're starting to see how power actually works. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who's operating it, because they're not going to teach you this in school. They're going to teach you that the free market created prosperity, but Morgan knew better. The free market wasn't the goal. The free market was the raw material.